This is the first lecture for topic 1, and in it we're going to be looking at the formal criminal justice system. So what is the criminal justice system, and what are you going to be learning about during the course of this semester? Well, the criminal justice system refers to two elements. One is the stages through which an offender passes: arrest, charging, trial, the correctional stages. We're going to talk about these different stages in detail in this lecture today. But these stages are implemented by specific criminal justice agencies. And these are the agencies that are charged with enforcing the law at each of these stages. And so throughout this semester, we'll be learning about law enforcement agencies. We'll be learning about the Office of the Prosecutor and what the prosecutor does. We'll talk about what happens in the court system, in the judiciary, both before a trial, during a trial, and after a trial. And then the final agency in the criminal justice system is after a person is sentenced, they are sent to the correctional system for implementation of the sentence. Now, your textbook talks about the formal versus the informal criminal justice process. And so the process are those stages that we were just talking about in the last slide and that we're going to go into more detail in one moment. And so the process takes the offender through a series of decision points, and key decisions are made at each of these points. It's oftentimes referred to as the criminal justice assembly line because you start with the first step and you go through basically 15 steps of the process. Now, as your textbook points out, very few people are processed through all of these steps. As you're going to learn, there's a lot of discretion that takes place, particularly in the police stage and the prosecutor's stage. And a lot of times people are, via this discretion, that people who enter the criminal justice process are kind of dealt with more informally, and often dealt with much more quickly, that leads to some of the steps in the process being skipped. And so, in the next lecture for this week, we're going to take a look at the funneling, known as the criminal justice funnel. How many start at the top, but at the end of the process, there are very few that make it through all of the steps. And there's reasons for why, and that's known as like more the informal criminal justice process. And there are two main reasons why there is this funneling that takes place, or two factors that impact it. One that, and we'll be learning about this in the next lecture, one is called the courtroom work group, and the other is this thing called the criminal justice system wedding cake. The different tiers that give us a sense of just how much attention each offender is going to get from the criminal justice system. And that helps us understand why there is, like, in theory, the process of the criminal justice process, but then there is also a more informal process that takes place. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to focus on the assembly line, the steps that offenders can go through. So let's get started. So, as I stated on the last slide, that in this lecture you will learn about all the steps in the formal criminal justice process. And in the next lecture, you'll learn about the criminal justice funnel and the factors that cause the winnowing effect. Now, if we were in class together, and this is what I've done when I teach this class face to face, is that we would watch clips of this HBO limited series called The Night of. It is an excellent series that does a great job of talking about criminal justice through, a fictional story. But it also does a really good job of actually showing the different steps in the criminal justice process, and also showing the funneling, how many don't go through all of the steps. So if we were together, we would be watching clips from The Night of. Well, we're not together, and for copyright reasons, I can't show you clips of The Night of and then publish it onto YouTube and my Canvas site. So, anyways, I'm going to try to do my best to bring the series to life for you, as we can use it as an example of the things that we're going to be talking about with the different steps. What the night of is it's a story about a young man, and so if you look in the bottom left-hand picture, it's about a young man, and his name is Nazir Khan, and he lives in Queens in New York. He's never been in any trouble at all. He's from an American Pakistan family. He's Muslim, and he's grown up in a relatively sheltered life. His dad owns a taxi cab, and that's what his dad does for a living. Well, one evening, Nazir Khan is going to go to a party in New York City with one of his friends. He's really excited because, like I said, he doesn't really get out very much. Lives a very sheltered life. His friend stands him up, and so Nazir Khan, being so excited about the party, he takes his dad's cab without his permission, and he drives into New York City from Queens in order to find this party that he wants to go to. Well, since he's driving a cab and he's never driven the cab before, and he has his on duty light in, every time he stops at a corner, not every time, but when he stops at a light or he pulls over because he gets lost in the city, people keep trying to get into his cab because they think he's an actual cab. And a young lady, and so in that picture you can see the young lady. Her name is Andrea Cornish. She's beautiful. She seems a little troubled, and she gets into the cab. And Nasir Khan is attracted to her, and so they drive throughout the city and they drink some beer. They go back to her house on the Upper West Side. They do a bunch of drugs, and then they have sex. And Nasir Khan passes out. He wakes up completely not knowing what happened at the kitchen counter in her house. And it's late, and he decides to go, and he goes upstairs to say goodbye to her. And when he goes upstairs, he sees her completely slaughtered body. She's been stabbed multiple times. And he freaks out. And through a series of mishaps, he basically runs out of the house. He forgets his keys inside. He has to break in to get back into the house to get his keys for the cab. Somebody across the street sees that. He takes the drugs that they were using. There's a knife that they use to cut up some limes for tequila, and it has blood on it. So he's basically just freaking out, and he puts all these things in his pocket and he goes. Well, he gets picked up by the cops because he makes a wrong turn, and ultimately he is arrested and tried for the death of Andrea Cornish. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see her name is Helen Weiss. She is the prosecuting attorney for the case. On the right-hand side on the top, that's Detective Box, and he's the lead homicide detective who investigates the case. And then in the bottom, that because Nazir Khan doesn't have a lot of money, he doesn't get a public defender, but he gets kind of a low cost attorney, whose name is John Stone, played by John Turturro, who you might be familiar with. And it's just a wonderful story about what happens when a person is waiting for trial. He is kept at Rikers Island. He basically kind of turns into a gang style sort of criminal. He kind of turns into this thing that he really isn't. And it's a story about just basically the criminal justice process. So it's that gives you a little bit of background. I won't tell you what happens. If you have HBO, I really encourage you to watch it. But we'll use some examples as we're going through the process of the criminal justice system to bring these things to life. So the criminal justice process, the formal process, can be broken into 4 stages. And so as you're taking notes, you want to write down stage 1, which is the police procedures, stage 2, the prosecutorial stage, stage 3, the trial stage, and stage 4, correctional procedures. So let's take a look at each of the steps in each of these stages next. All right, let's start with stage 1, police procedures. I'm going to go ahead and put up all the steps in stage 1, and then we're going to talk about them individually. So keep in mind that police are the gatekeepers of the formal criminal justice process. People enter into the process through the police. And the police have a lot of discretion, and they use their professional judgment to make decisions about whether or not people enter into the process. Now, let me put up the steps. 1, initial contact. 2, investigation. 3 arrest, and 4 custody. Now, keep in mind that as we're learning about these different steps today, we're going to go into them in a lot more detail later in the semester. This is just an overview of the process. And so this first chapter goes into, limited detail on each of these steps. But when we do our chapter on police and the rule of law, we're going to be going into a lot more information on each of these steps. And then also notice that you have like a little arrow. And so that gives you a sense of sort of the process that after the initial contact, an investigation is done. And then there's a decision about whether to arrest. So one step sort of leads to another. Okay. Now, on the left-hand side, you see that picture here, okay? And I'll describe what's going on in the picture, and then we'll sort of use that as illustration for these steps that I just talked about. And so, as I mentioned in the night of, Nazir Khan, after he kind of freaks out and finds the dead body and he runs from the scene of the crime, he gets into his dad's cab. It's 3 a.m. in the morning, and he drives away. Now, keep in mind, as I stated in the last slide, he was doing he was drinking, he was drunk, and he was doing drugs. And so he's driving around Manhattan at 3 in the morning, and he makes a wrong left turn. He makes an illegal turn. And wouldn't you know it, the cops are right behind him. And so this picture is basically showing that point with the cops shining the light into his cab. They pull him over. And that is basically sort of the initial contact that the police make with Nazir Khan. They're basically, the initial contact is they see him making an illegal turn, and they stop him to basically see what's going on. Now, there's a lot of different ways that cops have initial contact with people. One could be observation. So in this case, they observe him making an illegal turn. Other ways that we'll be learning about is that a victim might contact the police and tell them, the police, what went on, and then that will lead to an investigation. There could be a person who walks into the police station and gives a confession. There could be an informant that the police are working with that informs the police of a particular instance or a particular crime. There could be an initiative that could be going on. Like the mayor of the city could basically be saying, look, we seem to have a lot of prostitution. We want you to then go and begin an investigation. Okay. So there's lots of different initial contacts that police make. After the initial contact, then an investigation will take place. And an investigation can be from a few minutes to a month to multiple years, as they mention in your textbook, as police are investigating the BTK serial killer. In the night of, the investigation is very short. Nazir Khan unrolls his window, and the smell of tequila just comes spilling out of the car. And they make him get out of the car, and then they ask him to do a breathalyzer test. And so that is the investigation, to say you seem drunk, but let's investigate it and see if there's probable cause for arrest, that you actually blew over a certain limit, an amount, and the blood alcohol content is indicating that you are in fact intoxicated. Now, in the case of Nazir Khan, in the night of, just as they are beginning to give him a breathalyzer, the police, they get another call about this break-in on the Upper West Side. And so the cops really don't know what to do. They just throw Nazir Khan in the back of their car to go investigate this break-in. That is the break-in at Andrea Cornish's house. And so, again, there's this moment in the show where there's this discretion that the police are using. They're like, well, look, maybe we should just let him go. Well, but he seems drunk. Well, what should we do with him? Well, let's put him in the back of the car. And then they never give him the breathalyzer. And so, in fact, he almost gets away, except at the end of the day when they bring him down to the police station and they're going to let him go, they give him a pat down. And at that point, they find the knife, and at that point he is arrested. And so, if as a product of the investigation, there's sufficient evidence that a person seems to have committed a crime that's known as probable cause, the individual will be arrested. They can be arrested just based on what police officers see, but also sometimes arrest warrants are issued based on probable cause. And then that individual is taken into custody, and they will be kept at the police station while the police begin to continue to do an initial investigation, right? They'll continue to do, like, they may question the suspect. They'll have to read them the Miranda rights. They may get a warrant to, search the person's house, etc. But if it's clear that this individual is not going to be charged with the crime, then that person needs to be let go. So initial contact, investigation, arrest, and custody. And those are the 4 steps within the police procedure stages. Let's move on to the next stage. So stage 2 is the prosecutorial stage. And let me put up the different points here, and then we will go through all of these points. But at least there you have the steps of charging, preliminary hearing, arraignment, bail, plea bargaining. Now, if the arresting officers feel that there's sufficient evidence, they'll turn over the individual to the prosecutor's office. And the prosecutor is a lawyer who conducts the case against a defendant in a criminal court. They're known as the prosecuting attorney. They work at the prosecutor's office. In Wisconsin, we refer to them as district attorneys. Now, keep in mind, the prosecutors work for the state. They represent the state, and they defend the state against those who commit crimes against it. The prosecutor is a state employee. They're paid by taxpayer dollars. And at the state level, at least in Wisconsin and in most states, the prosecutor is elected by the people to a specific term of office. And so, they are really beholden, at least in theory, to the people of the state that they are representing. We also have federal prosecutors. They're known as U.S. attorneys, and they defend the United States against people who violate the federal criminal code. Now, the prosecutor, if the arresting officers feels that there's enough evidence, they'll turn the person over to the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor makes a decision about whether or not this person is going to be charged with a crime. Now, in state law, crimes are defined, and so if you're going to charge somebody, as in the case of Nazir Khan, with first-degree intentional homicide, basically the prosecutor has to have enough evidence to feel confident that if this case goes to trial, that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubts all the elements of the crime that make up first-degree intentional homicide. If they don't feel that they have enough evidence, they might charge the person with a lower crime, second-degree homicide or manslaughter. Now, keep in mind at the bottom there, it says that many people are arrested, but they're not charged. And that's because the prosecutor has discretion about whether or not they want to, based on the evidence, charge an individual with a crime. And if the prosecutor decides not to charge somebody, it means that they're unwilling to continue to pursue the case, and that is known as noli prosequi, okay? Latin for unwilling to pursue. And so that sometimes happens, right? Sometimes people will step out of the process at that moment because the prosecutor doesn't feel like there's enough evidence to charge somebody with the crime, because there might be some evidence, but not enough to get a conviction if the individual decides to go to trial. Now, we'll learn about each of these steps in more detail in the future. But if the prosecutor decides to charge, that there is a check on the charging powers of the prosecutor. And those checks are either the grand jury or a preliminary hearing. Basically, that the prosecutor says they want to charge somebody with first-degree intentional homicide, and then a grand jury will look at the evidence that the prosecutor has, and the grand jury is an actual body of people that's called to basically scrutinize the evidence of the prosecutor. And if they do feel that there's enough evidence for charging, then the grand jury will indict that individual. If they don't think there's enough evidence, then they will not issue a bill of indictment. A preliminary hearing is similar in terms of its purpose. It's a check on the prosecutor, but it's not, evidence isn't presented before a jury of people. Rather, it is presented in a courtroom before a judge. And the prosecutor makes their side, saying why this person should be charged. The defense attorney says, nope, this person shouldn't be charged, and here is why. And the judge makes the determination about whether the individual will be charged. If the individual, if the charge is basically okayed by in the preliminary hearing or the grand jury, then you need to bring the person into court to tell them what they're being charged with and to give them an opportunity to enter a plea. That's what you see happening on the right-hand side of the slide. Nazir Khan was brought into the courtroom. He was put in front of the judge. The judge told him that he was being charged with first-degree homicide. And he was asked, how does he plead? He pleads not guilty. And that the judge asks whether or not this individual understands the charges that are leveled against him. That's a constitutional right of habeas corpus that we have in the United States. If an individual enters a plea of not guilty, and usually at the arraignment stage they do, but not always, particularly for serious crimes, then it's up to the judge to determine whether or not this person should be let go on their own recognizance while they prepare for trial because they're pleading not guilty, or whether this person poses a danger to the community and should be kept in detention. And so in the case of Nazir Khan, that the prosecutor said that there should be no bail set because it was such a serious crime. And the judge agrees. And so Nazir Khan is remanded to Rikers Island in order to await trial. Sometimes a money bail is set, and if the individual is able to pay that money bail, then they can leave and prepare for trial outside of jail. But if many people are not able to make money bail. The final step is plea bargaining. After a person is charged and they plead not guilty, a process takes place between the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney, where they're basically saying, look, nobody wants to go to trials. Trials are costly. There might be pressure on the prosecutor, as there is in the night of, to plead down because they don't want this to go to trial. And then they try to work out a deal. And in the case of Nazir Khan, they worked out a deal to drop the charges all the way down to manslaughter with a flat 15-year guaranteed sentence or recommendation for a sentence. Nazir Khan actually accepts the plea agreement, but then something happens where the court will not accept the plea agreement. And so those are the 5 steps in the prosecutorial stage. Stage 3 is the trial stage. And let's put these up: trial, sentencing, and appeal after the conviction. Now, as I mentioned in the last slide, that plea bargaining between the defense attorney and the prosecutor is a part of that prosecutorial stage. The vast majority of cases in the United States do not go to trial. 90% of cases are resolved via plea bargaining. And later in the semester, we'll talk about whether that is problematic or not. And so they basically waive their right to a trial and they go directly to the correctional stage. If a person does not waive their right to trial, and that's what happens in the night of, and there's his attorney, John Stone, making a case for why Nazir Khan is not guilty, then a trial is held. You have a constitutional right to a jury trial, but a person can waive that right to a jury trial and have what's known as a bench trial. If they don't trust the jury, they may want to make their case in front of a judge and have the judge determine. There's many rights and responsibilities that the state and the individual has as it relates to trials, so we are not going to go into much detail here. If an individual, as a part of the trial, if the jury determines that this person is not guilty, then the individual is acquitted, and that's that. They walk free. The prosecutor can't come back and charge them again and try them again. That's against the double jeopardy clause in the Fifth Amendment. And so the process would start there if an individual is acquitted. The vast majority of people, though, who go to trial are not acquitted. 2/3 of the people are found guilty. And so after an individual is found guilty, then there is a sentencing. The sentences given by the judge, but it is guided, as we're going to learn, by state law. So the state law makes recommendations for if a person is found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, what is the punishment or the sentence that they uh, uh, would receive. There's a lot of different kinds of sentences or punishments that a person can get, from a fine to home detention to death penalty in the United States. After the sentencing, then an individual will move on to the next stage, which is the correctional stage. But then everybody has a right after conviction to appeal that decision of the jury. And so if you're found guilty, you have a right to one appeal, and you can appeal to the Intermediate Appellate Court. And in that appeal, you may make a case to say that your rights were violated, that evidence was admitted into court that shouldn't have been admitted into court. You could say that the jury instructions were off, that there was a lack of fairness, that you didn't have proper counsel. And then a panel of justices will decide whether or not to affirm your conviction, or whether or not they might say, yeah, there were problems in this trial and you should be retried. The final stage of the correctional procedure is the stage 4 correctional treatment. And so there are 3 steps in the correctional procedure stage. Step 1 is correctional treatment. Step 2 is release, and step 3 is post-release. The picture there is a picture of confinement. When Nasir Khan is in Riker Island, he teams up, or he's taken under the wing of a long-term convicted murderer whose name is Freddie Knight, and he's played by Michael Kenneth Williams, who, if you watched The Wire, he plays Omar in The Wire, and he's a great actor. And he has spent a lot of time in correctional treatment. Freddie Prinze has in this show. The correctional treatment, like I said, if the sentence is secure confinement, you're sentenced to actually a prison sentence. You'll be confined in a penitentiary, which is, if it's a state level crime, you'll be committed to a state penitentiary. That's usually for a sentence of over a year. If it's less than a year, you will be confined to a jail, which is run by the county. But the correctional treatment could be something like probation, that you're not going to be securely confined, but your movements and behaviors will be monitored by probation or home confinement. But that is a part of the correctional procedures. Parole officers or probation officers and other officers that work for corrections will be monitoring your activities. After you've satisfied your sentence, then you are released back into the community. And that oftentimes there will be some post-release help that you're given to make that transition from confinement into society a little bit more easy and also more successful. We'll be learning more about this during the course of the semester. Okay, so now that you've gone through all the steps, I want to let you know about an extra credit opportunity. So I've created a quiz where you can test your step on the steps of the criminal justice process. It's a fill-in-the-blank matching quiz. You have 5 minutes to take it, unlimited attempts. The idea is that you don't use your notes or your textbook. It's the honor system, but I mean, it's more fun if you actually put your notes away. Obviously, you should take notes during the lecture and read the textbook, but put those away and just test yourself. And since you have unlimited attempts, you can do whatever you take it as many times to get putting the steps into the correct order. Anybody who puts the steps into correct order will win 5 extra credit points, or earn 5 extra credit points. You have a week to take the quiz. And that for those individuals that do it in the least time with the least amount of attempts, the first 5 students that will do that will earn an additional 5 points for a total of 10 extra credit points. So have fun, good luck, and thanks for listening to the lecture, and I will talk to you again soon.